welcome to Diving into Discourse. I'm Javier Rojas, and in this episode, we're talking to CSUN political science professor Jason Morín. In this episode, we're talking about Latinos in the 2024 election. So, Jason, thank you for coming onto the show today.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Of course.
Pleasure to be here.
Of course. Let's start here. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and some of the things that you've been working on here at CSUN for the last few years.
Yeah, I'm a political science professor. I've been with the department since 2012. I specialize in American politics with an emphasis on Latino politics, racial and ethnic politics. Some of my publication and research focuses on Latino voting behavior, Latino political participation, Latino public opinion, and some of my more recent work examines the political influence of the private prison industry on immigration policy in Congress.
Interesting. Before we get into 2024, I'd like to just kind of pick your brain here. What in your studies and over the last few years of teaching, what has stood out to you when it comes to the Latino voting bloc in general?
The biggest thing is that Latinos are incredibly diverse as a population. Latinos come from multiple national origin groups, are diverse geographically. A large percentage of Latinos live in the Southwest, but also in places like Florida, New York, Illinois. And what we're seeing is more of a dispersion of Latinos living in other places that, like in the Midwest, that have smaller Latino populations. Additionally, what's also distinct about Latinos is that they are incredibly young as a population. So more recent estimates that came out showed that the median age for the Latino population is 30 years. So incredibly young, incredibly diverse, and a very large segment of the population. Currently, Latinos account for about 20% of the population as well. Fast growing, incredibly diverse. And what that means politically is that they have strategic political influence in presidential elections, in congressional races, and in local politics.
Interesting. So there's a lot to kind of decipher from that. Let's start here. I want to start around the 80s. I think that's kind of where there was the amnesty as well. And I think that's kind of, and that was what year was that? Like
1980, I believe 86.
Okay. We kind of start there, and from there to 2024, briefly touch on what the typical Latino voter was in America from that period to now, and kind of how things have shaped since.
I'd like to start back to think about California in the 1990s, right?
Okay, yeah.
So you can view Latinos as kind of a group that is not necessarily married to any political party. Latinos are not born to any political party. And this is because of the relatively youthful characteristics of Latinos as a population, but also as an immigrant group. In the 1990s, there were several policies that were passed that threatened the Latino community in places like California. So I think back to Proposition 187 that denied undocumented immigrants public services. And many Latinos saw that as threatening, right? And blamed Republicans. And during that period of time, Governor Pete Wilson used that as a way to campaign for re-election of governor. And many have found that Latinos, one of the reasons why California is a blue state is because of that time period, because of those threatening policies that push Latinos away from the Republican Party and towards the Democratic Party. And so since then, places like California has been a Democratic stronghold. Because Democrats have been aligned on policy issues that Latinos consider to be important.
Prop 187, correct me if I'm wrong, was about denying basic services, right, to undocumented immigrants?
Right. Yeah. And during that time, some of the political advertisements that Governor Wilson was putting out depicted immigrants as threatening, as criminal, and that led to a very bad impression among Latinos who were during that period of time.
And I think in the years after, you saw a lot of Latinos become leaders in their own communities. Some of them run for office.
Right, and that took some time, right? Yeah. So Latinos accounted for a very small percentage within the California state legislature, but by the 1990s, that began to grow, right? And that's just a function of significant demographics changes within the state, right? So prior to 2000, Latinos did not account were not the largest non-white group in the United States. By 2000, they became the largest non-white group in the U.S.
So it sounds like they start getting some sort of power and representation.
Greater power, representation, which leads to greater representation when it comes to public policy, right? So more recently, we saw the overturn of the ban on bilingual education, right? And that's a function of changes to the demographic population within California, but also changes to the descriptive representation within our California state legislature.
One of the first things I think of is, the mayor of LA during that period. I think it was Antonio Villaraigosa, the first Latino mayor, like a century as well. So you see these roots, these leaders start popping up.
Right.
Yeah. And then I'm kind of forwarding over to around 2008. Obama takes president.
Yeah.
Where are Latinos there in that period?
So Latinos overwhelmingly supported the Democratic Party and Barack Obama in 2008. And during that period of time, about 3 in 4 Latinos voted for Barack Obama. There was some concern at that period of time, being the first African American president, that he may not get the kind of support that he did. Yeah. But a lot of that concern was really overstated because Latinos showed up in support of Obama. In fact, it was more about just getting to know a new candidate because he was running against Hillary Clinton in the primaries.
Yeah. And then I think of things that he advocated for, like DACA. That's one of the things, during that period, he was advocating for that. There was a lot of Latino groups that were in support of him.
That came later.
Okay,
right.
Later.
So President Obama was pushing for a healthcare reform, right? And we got the ACA. The other concern was the 2008 economic crisis, and the Iraq War. And many Latinos were in support of withdrawing troops from Iraq and Afghanistan. Latinos were in support for greater government intervention to provide for healthcare coverage and the ACA. And Latinos were in support of more progressive policies and government intervention when it came to the economy at the time. So many of the policy positions that Latinos supported, that President Obama also supported as well. But during his presidency, there were challenges to overcoming hurdles to pass immigration reform, both in 2000 during the first term and the second term. So just prior to his re-election campaign over the summer, he signed the executive order DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Latinos were overwhelmingly in support of DACA and continued to support him in 2012. Again, that level of support was well into the 70% range. Barack Obama did face some criticism with regards to immigration because during his period while he was president, the number of deportations increased to an all-time high, and some refer to him as deporter-in-chief. Yeah. But Latinos saw past that because they were supportive of DACA.
Yeah. I think that's a good segue to what happens in 2016 or 15 with the arrival of, at the end, Donald Trump, and obviously the infamous first, press conference calling Mexicans, everything you can name in the book. Right. From that period, kind of want to explain what happens in that period when it comes to Latino voters post that before we get to 2024. Can just touch on that period?
Well, Latinos were mobilized to vote against Trump. Well, and just for context, both Clinton and Trump were considered to be the most unpopular candidates in recent history. Many polls were showing that. But many Latinos felt threatened by Trump and a Trump presidency, just as you said, by everything that making disparaging and racist remarks, calling Mexican criminals. And since then, he's doubled down on that language, right? And promising to build a border wall, increase deportations. So many Latinos felt threatened.
Yeah, sounds like the anti-Obama, everything that we just discussed.
That's right.
Yeah.
In that election, Latinos continued to demonstrate their support for the Democratic candidate in Hillary Clinton.
And then obviously Trump wins the next 4 years. Everything. Obviously, lots of things happened. By the time we get to 2020, where are the Latino voting bloc, and where do they stand? What do you think?
Yeah, so in 2020, Latinos continue to show their support for the Democratic Party. The percentage began to decline from 2016 to 2020. So still in the 70% range, but lower 70% at this point. And Latinos were in support of, and keep in mind the context of this, right? So there was COVID that was going on. There was economic fallout as a result. So there's all of these health issues that were coming along, and because of COVID-19, and then as a result, the economy was failing because of businesses having to close, right? And keep in mind that people of color and Latinos specifically were being disproportionately affected by the pandemic and the economic outcome. And so in that election, Latinos continue to support for the Democratic Party in Joe Biden, and turnout was extraordinarily high. If you look at just the popular vote overall, 81 million people voted
at the time, the record, I believe,
right, for Joe Biden. And in the midst of a pandemic and social distancing. And that really speaks to the coordinated effort of the Democratic Party to focus on mail-in ballots, but also the work of nonprofit organizations as well, right? So keep in mind, 2 states in particular went towards Joe Biden, right? We have Georgia, right?
Historically.
Right, with a large African-American voting population, but also Arizona, which historically has not gone blue.
I believe it was 1994.
It's been a long time. That's right. So, but that's largely in part due to the groundwork that nonprofit organizations and Latino organizations were doing at that time to flip that state.
Interesting. With all that being said, though, you did mention that there started to become a kind of drop in support, a little bit drop.
Right. We begin to see a drop in support overall.
Before we hit 2024, in that moment in time period, did you think, well, over the next few years, things might change? Did you ever kind of have that thought when it comes to the Latino voters? That
it's difficult to say because you're comparing. You're only looking at 2 points in time, right? But then you start to, so you need to look at more elections to see whether or not there's a pattern emerging, right? And so when you look at the 2024 election, I think that's when people started to look at a larger pattern.
Interesting. Okay. Now that we're here at 2024 and kind of we've had a month or so to kind of digest everything that's happened since then. Why, in the most simplest way, why do you think Latinos supported Trump this past election more than the previous 2? And that's a very, loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, so what we're seeing is that Latinos were really what happened in 2024 is that Trump consolidated his base. So he wasn't winning hearts and minds. Yeah. He wasn't Democrats weren't defecting from the political party, right? But in other words, he was gaining more support among those Latinos who are more likely to support Trump already, right? So we're talking about Republicans, we're talking about evangelicals, those that are ideologically conservative, Cuban voters, Latinos that live in Florida, and third generation voters, right? Yeah. So Trump was capturing more of that particular demographic, right? Yeah. As opposed to influencing or swaying, let's say, more Democrats or left-leaning independents.
Yeah, interesting. So he kind of got this side of the election block just by being himself. Yeah. And not trying to attract those voters by trying to be different. He was himself, and Latinos kind of saw themselves in that.
Well, and part of that's a function of like what else is happening too. We're entering into a phase of U.S. politics where politics is incredibly polarized, right? So you're seeing more individuals shift into their camps, not just ideologically, right? But in terms of beliefs about what the role of government is, polarized on a social level and even on an economic level, and demonstrating not just support for your own party or party members, but dislike and perhaps even hatred towards people outside of your party. Interesting. So what you're seeing in 2024, perhaps, and why Trump is able to consolidate more of his base, is particularly more conservative Latinos, is that in 2024, in comparison to previous elections, is because of this larger context that's going on.
Interesting. I hear this common refrain that issues like the economy and healthcare, things like immigration, they were once issues that maybe white Americans cared about only back then, and now these are issues that are affecting Latinos, and they're being addressed in a way that they're Americans too. They're no longer the monolith. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, Latinos have always one of the myths or stereotypes about Latinos is that immigration is the number one issue, right? Yeah. It's an important issue. It's historically been a wedge issue as well. Like if you can't get on board for comprehensive immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship, then perhaps it's time to move on, right? But historically, the economy, kitchen table issues has been a number one priority, right? Immigration has been up there too, right? But it's historically not been the number one issue. So just like other communities, people care about basic things like housing affordability, paying for groceries, right? And that was magnified in the 24 election. So even though you're seeing all these improved indicators, let's say with lower unemployment, higher levels of GDP, one of the things that those indicators are missing is greater levels of economic inequality, right? And the difficulty to purchase a home, right? And these are the things that that matter to people, not just Latinos, but everyone, right? And I also think that what's happening is that Latinos are still feeling the effects of COVID-19. So there's a little bit of that going on too. And so in the 2020 election, we learned that Latinos who viewed as the economy as the most important issue versus COVID-19 were more likely to vote for Trump, right? And that kind of goes back to Trump's messaging, right? So because he was all for opening up the economy if he was elected president. And Latinos who saw COVID-19 as the most important issue were more likely to vote for Biden. And so I suspect that in 2024, Latinos who saw the economy as the most important issue were more likely to vote for Trump again in 2024. And so despite some of these economic gains that occurred under the Biden administration.
Yeah, many, some of these Latinos didn't see those gains in themselves, in their own household, sounds like as well. Yeah,
and there's a different, and so there's also just a difference between what the economy is and what the perception of it is too.
Correct. And I think the result that we saw in 24 showed that. It also seems that that Trump didn't hit on identity politic issues. He went straight for the American issue, like I said, kitchen table issues.
Right. So, and so in 2016, he focused on immigration, right?
Yep.
And so that, as I mentioned beforehand, was super threatening, right? In 2020, Trump didn't focus on immigration issues as much because we just really didn't have time to do it, right? So, I mean, the economy and COVID were the number one priorities. And so in 2024, there was a turn again to immigration issues, but also the economy too.
Yeah, very interesting. With all this being said, and looking at some of the numbers that have come out now that things been kind of finalized, what surprised you from the results? What are some big takeaways?
Well, one is that one of the takeaways is that the shift that, even though that Trump did make gains among Latinos, so the shift is perhaps overstated, right? So, just as an example, so many of the polls that you see in the media are based upon exit polls, and so they don't necessarily do the best job in terms of generalizing about smaller populations like Latino populations. And so they don't interview, for example, in different languages. And so the media tends to rely on the same survey research firm that puts out these exit polls that that tends to have a major influence on the narrative and where Latinos stand when it comes to presidential politics. And so the 24 election showed that 51% of Latinos voted in favor of Harris, right? A slim majority.
Yeah.
And this was a decrease from, 66%?
Something in that range,
in 2016, right? And in 2020, it was about the same, 65%. So what that means was that there was about a 14 percentage point drop, which is pretty big, right?
In 4 years,
in the difference between two key elections, right? Or between, and so it's a major drop. So that's one question. That leads me to raise an eyebrow at first, right? So that's a big drop, but why is that happening, right? And then but the other part of it too is that it suggests that Latinos are truly in the middle and can go either way, right? Which is also surprising given that such an overwhelming majority voted for Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in past presidential elections. So, but as I mentioned beforehand, these exit polls, right, are not necessarily representative of Latino voters, right? So if you look at surveys, that percentage is in the 70% range, right? 79%, then 70% in 2020, and then it drops to 62%. Now, in both cases with representative surveys and exit polls, there's a decrease, right? But the decrease the starting point is much higher for the representative surveys as opposed to the exit polls. So the interpretation is still different.
There's something missing there.
Right. So you still see a majority of Latinos, a firm majority of Latinos in representative polls that are in support of Democratic candidates, but you still see a decrease, right? So they're both showing a decrease, but a majority of Latinos are still, according to representative surveys, polling that Democrats still have support from the Latino community.
So it would be wrong to just create a narrative saying this is the kind of the end of Latinos and Democrats, right?
Right.
Okay.
At this point, right? Yeah. And so what explains that decrease, right? Yeah. That's the next question, right? Because you're seeing it both in exit polling and surveys.
Something shifted.
Something shifted. So what I've been able to find is that it's really due to a decrease in party defection on the part of Republicans, Republican Latinos. So in 2016, there were, just to make sure I get this right, in 2016, there were 22% of Republicans voted for the Democratic candidate,
22%.
Barack Obama.
Okay.
22%. So about 75% voted in favor of of Trump.
Okay.
Right? So you're seeing about a quarter of Latinos, of Republican Latinos that are just defecting, right? Suggesting that party doesn't play the same kind of role that it does for other voters, for let's say white voters, for example, right? By the time you get to 2024, the percent of Republican defectors decreases to 6%. So again, it gets to my point that really what Trump did in 2024 is consolidate his base.
Yeah.
Right? So if you subtract that 22% from 6, you get what, 16%?
Yeah.
Now, the polling show that Harris got 61% of the vote, 62% of the vote, right? In 2020 and 2024. Add that 16%. It climbs back to 78%. What you would see in 16.
So he hasn't lost any Latino voters.
So it's really more about capturing Republicans, right? And it goes and kind of reflects this era of polarization that we're seeing today that's heavily influenced by a candidate that will pretty much just say anything, right? But other things that are going on, right? Social media, the nationalization of politics that's trickling down to local politics, the role of interest groups becoming more partisan than ever before, just looking at money in politics, and the role of the media.
Interesting. I want to touch on the media part because I feel that is where we're having this discussion, but many people might not be familiar with some of the things that we're talking about. Where does the media have their big, where are they missing when it comes to covering Latinos, especially when it comes to elections? Because I feel that Latinos only get spoken about in this way when it comes to elections, but not every day.
One of the things is that there's a tendency to treat places like Rio Grande, Texas, right, in Florida, as a microcosm of something that larger that is happening, like Latinos shifting right, for example.
Yeah.
So, but the issue with that is that politics is still super regional, right? There's, as I mentioned beforehand, Latinos are diverse, right? So there's the policy preferences of Latinos from national origin groups to regions can differ slightly, right? So Cubans, for example, have more conservative attitudes towards policy compared to Mexicans living in Texas versus California, right? So so what's happening in the Rio Grande Valley is much different than the political context of California, or even in New York or Illinois, right? So one of the things I think that's missing is a tendency to overgeneralize based upon the politics that are happening at the very local level, right? It's super interesting, right? And it's worth investigating, but it's not necessarily representative.
Yeah, so we're lumping all these people into one category, which is not necessarily true. Everyone has their own reasons for voting the right way they do, and
and I'm not the only one to make this criticism, right?
Yeah.
So, and the other thing too is that, and this is something I think that both media pundits and academics need to do a better job of is to expand our understanding of national origin groups beyond Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, because there's over the years, because of over more recent years, there's been a significant increase in immigrants from Central America, right? There's been an increase in immigrants from South America, Venezuelans, for example. So it's important that we have a better understanding of these particular national origin groups when it comes to U.S. politics.
Do you have confidence in by 2028 we're going to learn some of these lessons when it comes to the media coverage? Do you think there will be better media coverage by then? Do you think
it's tough, right? I feel like we will most likely get more of the same. I think that the outreach, although it can improve, right? Both by political parties. This is just kind of I feel like I'm segueing over to political parties, but there's got to be more outreach by political parties. Less than half of the Latino population was mobilized or contacted by a political party or nonprofit. But political parties can always do a better job. Democrats are always more likely to reach out and contact Latino voters in comparison to Republicans. But there's always room for improvement. And they are improving their strategies to reach out to create messaging that's more national origin focused. Right? So there's evidence. So there's more instances of micro targeting, which is I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
But again, more of that can be done, not just starting in the fall, right? Just months prior to an election, but start that mobilization effort early. Earlier than usual.
Yeah, of course. Maybe like a year ahead of time and whatnot. But I want to touch on that issue of messaging. I think that was brought up a lot in the weeks after the election, where Democrats didn't do enough messaging or the wrong type of messaging, and they took Latino voters for granted. What do you think about that?
I think the messaging was there, especially for the Harris camp, but Harris was facing a lot of challenges, right? She was treated as the incumbent, right? Because she was representing the incumbent's party, but she didn't have the same amount of time to campaign, right, as Donald Trump. And that was a major challenge. Now, I do think she made inroads with the electorate and the Latino electorate, but time matters at the end of the day. And if you think about it, Donald Trump has been campaigning since 2016.
Yeah.
Right? So he campaigned in 16, he campaigned in 20.
Never really stopped.
And he continued to campaign in 24.
Yeah.
And the other elephant in the room is that he had the support of a billionaire, right? That had control of an entire social media app, right? That
definitely
was
helped.
mobilizing his base. Right. So she was facing a lot of challenges to begin with. But I think in the little time that she had, her representing the Democratic Party improved turnout. Right. I think it would have been much lower. I think it would have been lower had President Biden stayed in the race.
Interesting. Where do you see a topic like misinformation falling into this conversation that we're having? I'd just like to know your thoughts on it.
It's rampant in social media. There's a lack of regulation. And I just saw a report that Facebook is going to lift its fact-checking as well. So that's going to be so it suggests that misinformation, disinformation, right?
And intentionally targeted wrong facts. Wrong information.
Right. To persuade voters, right, in either direction. Is going to continue to be a major issue because that's where a lot of people get their news these days, right? Especially young Latino voters.
I was going to say that,
So if you look at 2024, about 58% of new and young voters in their 20s voted for Kamala Harris. And if you break that up by gender, that drops even more for young men. Right. And the issue is that young people are more likely to get their news from social media in comparison to like newspapers, television, et cetera. Right. So that could have an influence on future elections.
It sounds like we're having just various different media ecosystems.
Right.
And people are getting, different, outlets and whatnot. With all those being said, where do you see Latino voters going in the next few years? I know it's hard to tell. We're a week away from the inauguration, but
we'll soon find out, right? So Trump has promised mass deportations on day one.
But polls do show that there is some support from Latinos as well.
That's true, right? So, Latinos support more border security, right? Not necessarily mass deportation. So there's support for border security, but in the same breath, Latinos also support a pathway to citizenship, right? And a pathway to legal status. So to suggest that Latinos are in support of these highly restrictive immigration policies is just not true. So I suspect if Trump does continue to carry out these mass deportation plans, even if they're on a smaller scale, like let's say just isolated raids, right? That get a lot that are likely to get major media attention. It may have a similar effect of what you see in 2016, right? Where Latinos will be once again feel threatened by his immigration policies. Latinos, for example, overwhelmingly opposed family separation in 2018 as a result of zero tolerance, right? And so, many Latinos know somebody who is undocumented, right? Who is, whether it's a family member or a friend, or just a colleague. So it would become very personal, I would imagine, right? If this were to play out, and once Trump takes office, and keep in mind that Latinos are not just more supportive of more progressive immigration policies, right? Even despite more border security, the polls that you see with regards to border security, but Latinos are more progressive on issues related to healthcare, the economy, education, corporate regulation, right? Housing, all of these things. So their positions on policy has not changed, right? But it's going to be key for whoever becomes the Democratic nominee to focus on the issues that Latinos care about.
Yeah, things that matter.
That's right.
Yeah.
But it's important for Democrats to continue to, the Democratic Party and leadership to continue to continue their outreach, continue their messaging, right? And not stay silent on important issues.
Very good. Does the Democratic Party need Latino voters like they did many years ago to win? Or is it something that they can live without? What do you think?
Democrats rely on a coalition, right, of white voters and people of color. Republican Party did not need to rely on that kind of coalition, right? So if you look at places like Pennsylvania, for example, or places like, I believe even places like, places like Arizona or even Michigan, Trump did not need the Latino vote in order to win those particular states. So because the population is, Latinos are important, but electorally, but in that particular state, let's say Pennsylvania, account for 6% of the voting population. So, and just over 50% voted in favor of Harris. And so he would need, in order to actually, for Harris to win or to make significant gains, almost every single Latino voter to support Harris.
That's interesting.
Right? Which is just not possible.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
So I think Trump and the Republican Party is well aware of the demographics that they need. I mean, that's partly explains why Trump went all in trying to court the white working class in 2016 and followed a very similar playbook in 2024.
Do identity politics still matter in our country? I feel like as we're getting more diverse and more polarized, having these specific campaigns targeted towards the demographic, does that matter?
I think it does.
Yeah.
Identity politics has always existed, right? Just in different ways, right? So when there's questions about identity politics, it's typically about race and ethnicity. But it matters when you have policies that target specific groups, right? I mean, we cannot ignore the history of race relations in the United States. It's had a profound impact on our politics, and so that's why it's important for us as a society to move towards more equitable and equity-minded policies, right? But politics beyond that, but there's identity politics beyond race and ethnicity. Party is a form of identity politics, right? And it's incredibly heightened right now.
It's very,
right? So you're getting, so there's examples of people not buying products because they know that they support Trump, right? I take the My Pillow guy,
Yeah.
right? I wouldn't imagine that there would be a Democrat supporting purchasing a pillow from the My Pillow guy because he supports Trump,
Yeah.
right?
Or something like buying Starbucks or something.
Or the president, or Goya beans, for example, right?
Yeah.
That's another example.
Yeah.
There's instances of polarization even at the social level, where you're having people are just unwilling to engage in relationships with one another because they're from a different party.
Yeah.
Right? That's identity politics too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's going to continue to play a role, but in U.S. politics, if it's based on race, ethnicity, party, really anything,
it's not going away.
It's not going away.
Where do you predict Latinos going forward over the next few years?
It's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
I am really interested in knowing what the political trajectory of young Latino voters will be.
Yeah.
Right? Young Latino voters, as we mentioned, Latinos are relatively young, are incredibly young as a population. But young people are not socialized in the same way yet. Their connections to the party is not the same.
Yeah,
right?
compared to
older people.
Yeah.
Right. A majority, as we mentioned, get their news from information from social media, right? And how is that going to impact their outlook on politics, right, moving forward? Especially when you have a platform that is relatively unregulated and controlled by billionaires, but they also just live in a generation from a generational perspective where all they know is Trump era politics, right? So one of the things that I constantly tell my students in class is that politics was divisive, right? It was certainly heated in the past, but this is different than what it used to be, let's say, in the early 2000s during the Bush era, or even the 1990s during the Clinton era. Much different, right, than what it used to be. And so the vitriol that we're seeing in politics is something that they're accustomed to, right?
They grew up with this.
So this is kind of normalized.
Yeah.
And to me, somewhat scary,
Yeah.
right? To think that this is politics as usual, where
it's not.
It shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Right? So I have a lot of questions surrounding new voters, right? But I do have a lot of faith in new voters too, right? There's a lot of misconceptions about young voters not being interested in politics. Young Latino voters are interested in politics. They are interested in policy issues. The key is to influence the next step, right? To get them to turn out to vote.
I think that was a big missing point in this past election. Many didn't come out.
And part of that, I think, also comes down to leadership as well. Well, in terms of finding the candidate that can reach a younger audience, but also it comes down to making the process easier to vote for younger people. Sometimes younger people don't vote because they don't have the same kind of resources, right?
Yeah.
Especially nowadays, right? When I talk to my students, they're working 2 jobs, multiple jobs, going to school, helping out at home, and you only have so much time in the day to kind of think about things. And so if we can figure out ways to make that process easier, I think that would certainly be helpful. And fortunately, California has kind of led the way in that regard.
I was going to say we're an exception when it comes to some of these issues that you're talking
That's
about.
That's
right. Also, many young people are very much online all the time now. They can't disconnect from politics, like you said. And when things like memes start turning into political, attacks, things like that, it's hard to decipher between the two anymore. So I'm just interested in, where the voting bloc goes over the next few years.
Yeah, my other concern too is not just the part of the misinformation, but the influence that social media has on the negative impact that social media can have, or just on face-to-face contact,
Yeah.
right, with one another.
Yeah. We're having less of it, I would assume.
We're having less of it, right?
That's what I see. People are home more than ever. What does that have an effect with?
And that can have an impact not just on social trust, right, with one another, but political trust as well.
Yeah.
Becoming less trusting of government officials, and the motivations behind what our representatives are saying.
Yeah.
Right. So if we're less trusting, then that may mean we're not going to be as participatory in politics.
Yeah.
Potentially less engaged, and just kind of revert to whatever we're doing. Right.
Yeah.
So, this is not necessarily representative, but it's just an anecdote. But when I was listening to some interviews of people, there were several of people that were being interviewed that were just saying, well, I'm just not going to vote in this year's election because I'm just done with it.
Yeah. Doesn't do anything for me.
Right. Because most of what you're going to see in social media just like media in general, is going to be negative news stories, right?
Yeah.
And attacks.
Yeah.
And you're going to see a lot more of that in social media. You could see participation rates in the last election, right?
Yeah.
So where did those 81 million voters go? It went down, decreased from 81, I believe, to 74 million.
That's what I think so too.
And Trump was around 77, 78 million.
Yeah.
So there was certainly a decrease from the previous election.
It sounds more and more like 2020 might have been a one-off. Maybe because everyone was home. Maybe, I don't know. I'm kind of reading through the tea leaves here, but it sounds like something
I like to
changed.
think of the COVID years as a blip,
Yeah, definitely feels like that.
like the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just kind of happened. Yeah, it's hard. Any last thoughts here going forward? Any things that stick out to you, or something that you want to emphasize?
At this point, I'm just we're at this point. I think it's more about a wait and see.
Okay.
Right. I know that there's a lot of fear regarding what surrounding a Trump administration, and when it comes to mass deportations, and what kind of impact that's going to have on families, right? Yeah. Citizens, non-citizens alike, and not just Latinos, but other immigrant populations, communities of color. We saw, again, instances of family separation. By the way, some of those children that were separated still have yet to be reunited with their parents.
Yeah.
Because of poor record keeping. There was government repression in response to BLM protesters in Portland. There was the Muslim ban, right, that led to chaos including for people that were here on visas. If the Trump administration in the 2016, in the previous term, was any indication of what's to come, we can probably expect more of the same, but probably more of it, right?
Yeah.
And so it's important, I think, more than ever for we as a community to support one another when others are being attacked, right? And when others are feeling the full weight of government when it comes to some of the policies that he proposes.
Thank you. This is all I have right now. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Javier Rojas, and this is Diving into the Discourse. Thank you.